Again, I'm not advocating that climate change is a great thing. I think it's a massive problem. What I'm really trying to say, I think there's a certain cognitive dissonance, which is when you receive the message that you don't want to hear, the response is to attack the messenger. And
I'm not attacking you.
I am a Republican, so.
Actually, we're all related to the Arctic in more ways than one. Science also tells us that the Arctic is an incredibly important system in the global climate system. So just like the Amazon are the lungs of the world, the Arctic is like our circulation system and feeds in to global climate change everywhere. Science also tells us that the Arctic is in crisis. We know, based on observational data, that we have lost 50% of Arctic ice in about 50 years. So just when the World Economic Forum was starting, the Arctic was very white, and over that time period, it is increasingly blue. Now, why would we care? Well, we care because of the albedo effect, and that is a thing in climate science where if something is white, it bounces off sunlight back out into the atmosphere, and it doesn't absorb. As the Arctic Ocean and the glaciers have melted, we see that dark blue is absorbing more and more heat, which is feeding through the rest of the system. We also know that the Arctic ice is fracturing. It's getting thinner. I said we've lost 50% of it, but in terms of old ice, we've lost close to 95%, the vast majority of it. That is a huge concern for Arctic science. In terms of sea ice volume, the picture is even worse. Since the 1970s, we have lost 75% of the volume of Arctic summer sea ice. If you think of that as the insurance policy for the rest of the world to prevent catastrophic runaway climate change, we are in trouble. And we can see here the loss to today. Now, we've got Google Earth data that we're showing for the first time today, which is observational data of various places in the Arctic, which uses satellite data for 30 years and shows where we were in 1984 and where we are in 2009. This is in Alaska. This is another one in Alaska, and we can see that we are massively changing the topography of the Arctic. It is no longer white, it is increasingly green, and it is absorbing heat, and CO2 emissions, of course, are rising globally. So this is again in Alaska, in the USA, and as we approach 2019, the picture is stark. If we look at Greenland, which is a huge glacier, of course, in the Arctic glacier ice sheet, we can see again in 1984, it's very white. We can see as we progress through the 1990s and approach the 2000s and approach the current decade, we can see it's not so white anymore. And that's a physical change, that's observational data that is very stark and concerning. When we look at glacier melt, we can see that it is tremendous. The glacier sheet in Greenland has lost 4 trillion metric tons since 2002. In one day alone, in 2019, August 1st, we lost enough melt in the glacier to fill 4.4 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. Tremendous change happening in Greenland. We also see, though, that the Arctic is white, it's greening, and then we can see that the permafrost is thawing. Now, permafrost, of course, releases methane, which is a concentrated CO2 gas, and if all the permafrost in the Arctic is released, that is like adding in the CO2 emissions of all EU countries. It's a sobering thought. Again, how we can see here is that the Arctic is warming. The anomalies of the temperature are severe, and we can see how it's happening. So as CO2 emissions are rising around the world, we can see that that's coming back into the Arctic, and we can see how that is affecting us. Now, we're all affected by images of polar bears. We can see the polar bear looking for ice, looking for a place to rest. And indeed, as the Arctic changes, the situation is dire for many Arctic species and Arctic-based communities, of course. But Earth system science tells us that actually we are the polar bear too. Why is that? That's because the Arctic is feeding into the global climate system, is protecting through the albedo effect, and that is decreasing rapidly. We also see how the Arctic is building extreme weather events globally. So if the Arctic sea ice goes, data in research suggests that we will actually accelerate global warming by 25 to 40%. On top of that, if we take a look at on top of that, though, we can see that with the Greenland ice sheet, we are accelerating sea level rise. And this again is data looking at what are the projections. If we get to a 2-degree warmer world, we can see from some of the major cities around the world, including Tokyo and New York, that they will indeed be flooded. If we stay at the 1.5 Paris aspirational target, we will save the Arctic summer sea ice and prevent images like this happening when we get to 2 degrees. 2 degrees is not safe. 1.5 definitely is. So from a scientific perspective, from my perspective, that the Arctic is a barometer of global risk. What happens in the Arctic does not stay there. And what's at stake is not a geopolitical question alone or the short-term economic benefits from shipping or extraction. What's at stake in the Arctic is actually the future of humanity itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So let's dive into some of the factors that you have mentioned. The dramatic melting that we watched here, that you showed us, is also serving as a precondition for the emergence of the Arctic, that is a region of the planet that has long been largely ignored as a focus of interest and activity in recent years. We're seeing fossil fuel development, a sharp increase in shipping that's projected to soar. These are among the developments that are transforming the region further. They're also turning it into an arena of intensifying geopolitical tensions, as you alluded to. All of these changes could further aggravate the environmental degradation which plays into the global climate system that you mentioned. So to start us off here, I wonder, Mr. Minard, if you would help us to understand the economic forces, the commercial forces now at play. When we talked before this panel, you told me that you believe that the forces driving development in the Arctic are now unstoppable. Tell us why that is and what's bringing money to the Arctic.
Well, I mean, there are two important factors. One, of course, is commercial. There are a lot of opportunities for commercial development in the Arctic, and not along the lines that people traditionally think. I mean, yes, there are rare earths, there is oil and gas and fossil fuels, but there's also a lot of other interesting things going on in the Arctic, including aquaculture, the development of human capital, and then, of course, the rise of Arctic shipping. Of course, the other piece that's making this, I think, irretrievable is the fact that it is so important strategically for military reasons. Russia has committed to $15 billion over the next 10 years for Arctic port development and Arctic infrastructure development. And in the United States, as China and Russia become much more active in the Arctic, the need to defend our northern border is going to put more and more pressure on politicians to take up defense in the Arctic. One of the good pieces of news is we have an opportunity to do it right. That is that in the United States, after the Second World War, President Eisenhower implemented the National Defense Highway Act, which allowed for the building of essentially autobahns, or the interstate highway system in the United States, where military money was used that also catalyzed economic development. Of course, when you use government money, you get to establish rules. And so there could be an opportunity here through the military development to responsibly apply rules to what is the commercial forces which are going to inevitably come.
Okay, I want to come back to rules and how possible governance could be implemented, but I'd like to hear, what does all of this mean, Madam Prime Minister, for Nordic countries? What are the opportunities, but especially what are the risks of some of the development that Mr. Minor just talking about for Finland and for other countries?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with the point been taken in the presentation that the Arctic issue is so much more than geopolitical issue or issue of geopolitical contest or competition or tension. It's about climate, it's about our future, and that's why we need to tackle climate change if we want to save the Arctic, and also tackle the risks concerning about the geopolitical issues. Of course, from Finland's perspective and point of view, it's very important that we keep the Arctic zone as low tension as possible. And it's very important that we have also the tools to do this. We have the Arctic Council, and it's very important to increase the role of the Arctic Council and all the countries that are involved in the Council's work. So we have a tool where we can have ownership in the Arctic, the climate issue, other environmental issues, and also issues concerning about the geopolitical contest.
Is the Arctic Council adequate? Are you concerned, for example, about the buildup by Russia? And is the Arctic Council adequate for dealing with that buildup?
Well, of course, there are a lot of things that we need to work on, but it's the best we have. And I think strengthening our Arctic Council is a thing that we all should concentrate it on.
Mr. Gore, Mr. Vice President, let's bring this back to the environment. All of these developments that Mr. Minor thinks are inevitable, geopolitical and commercial and otherwise, what's the impact that you see? What is your concern? And help us to understand why this matters.
Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this. I want to congratulate Prime Minister Marin. Very exciting news that she is the new Prime Minister of Finland. For one reason, I look at this new generation of very young prime ministers and heads of state around the world. I just think it's great, and almost all of them have the values that I admire so much. But thank you for the wonderful presentation. Of course, it won't surprise you perhaps to hear that, in my view, by far the most important aspects of the Arctic are the environmental aspects, and in the presentation we heard about the change in albedo, the reflectivity of the surface. When the Arctic Ocean is covered by ice and snow, more than 90% of the incoming sunlight bounces directly off the surface and back into space. When the ice melts, the dark ocean and the dark land surrounding the ocean absorb about 90%. So it's a magnifier. And the temperatures in the Arctic are rising 3 times faster than in the rest of the world. And that is also, you hinted perhaps a bit elliptically at the connection to some other consequences around the world, but you know, the Earth is the climate is a giant engine for redistributing heat from the tropics to the poles. And the ratio of temperature at the equator to temperature at the North Pole, South Pole is very different. South Pole is land surrounded by ocean. The North Pole is ocean surrounded by land. But when that ratio of temperature at the equator and temperature at the North Pole changes significantly, as it has, a 1 degree increase at the equator is a 3 degree increase at the North Pole, then all of the pattern of wind and ocean currents that transfer that heat energy are forced to change. The Gulf Stream is slowing down. We've seen the Northern Hemisphere jet stream become much loopier, and the scientists who have studied this are winning the argument, in my view, that this is directly connected to a lot of phenomena, particularly in the northern hemisphere. So last June, there was an important scientific paper published, peer-reviewed, showing that nitrous oxide emissions from the Arctic are 12 times larger than had been previously thought. Now, nitrous oxide is the third or fourth most potent greenhouse gas, depending on how you count black carbon. And that's a big amount. It's roughly, 3, 4, 5 days worth of global warming annually. But the major question is, if those emissions are increasing 12 times greater, what does that imply about the emissions of methane and CO2? Yep. The area covered is so large that scientists have not really been able to monitor it. But we have these methane bubbles in Siberia, thousands of them. Some of them blow out and leave these exit craters, quite dramatic images. And it comes out either as methane or a carbon dioxide, depending upon the presence or absence of moisture as the permafrost warms up. And the real danger is that we could cross what the scientists have called one of the tipping points, beyond which this could become a self-reinforcing process, and we have to avoid crossing that threshold.
Let me just jump back in, though. The part of the challenge here, it seems to me, is that while this is a crisis and the people sitting on this stage understand that and see that and understand the science, to some players, this is an opportunity.
Yeah, okay.
And
I mean, there's going to be shipping. There already are some shipping routes mapped out. As for oil and gas production, it count me as skeptical because the harshness of the environment is still there, and we have a subprime carbon bubble. We have $22 trillion of carbon assets already discovered, already marked to market on the books of multinationals and sovereigns that can never be burned.
But that, please.
But about the question that you ask, I think it's so short term to see melting of the Arctic as an opportunity. It's so short term. If we look at the long term situation, we should fight climate change. We should do more. We should do it faster. Actually, Finland is committed to be climate neutral by 2035, and we are committed, our government, to tackle climate change now. We see that climate change is the big risks, the biggest risk humanity faces, but actually fighting climate change is a big opportunity for our technology, our businesses, creating new jobs, creating new well-being. So it's so short term to look Arctic and the melting of Arctic as a possibility for businesses. We should look at the long term.
And I would agree with Prime Minister Marin on that point. I mean, I think that the only way to save the Arctic, sea ice especially, is to unite behind the science and have every single political business decision globally trying to bend emissions curves dramatically. And we launched at Arctic Base Camp at Davos on Monday a Unite Behind the Science campaign with Christiana Figueres, Greta Thunberg's involved, and global scientists, because we need the evidence and we need the business decisions to do so. Because if we simply do shipping in the Arctic as an opportunity and we use heavy fuel oil, and don't do that sustainably, that's just going to increase the black carbon and increase the feedbacks.
But no, I think there are a couple of elements of realism that we have to introduce here. First is, based upon the pace at which we are addressing the SDGs, we will get there and hit the target sometime near the end of the century. I believe we will be well past the tipping point at that point. So when we look at this and say, what can we do?
Based on what evidence, I'd have to suggest. That statement
on the data that I've looked at. I'm sorry I don't have all the information here, but anyway, if the reality is, until the stakeholders who are involved here have real incentives to do what is in their economic best interest, all the discussion, and forgive my expression here, but all the discussion of the do-gooders in the world is not going to change the behavior of commercial enterprise.
Actually, that's not true
You've
because
you've heard the phrase, there are no jobs on a dead planet.
Yeah.
Right?
But exactly.
I think,
let's
sorry to
pull
interrupt you,
back.
Prime Minister.
Let's pull back, but perhaps this is where
Yeah.
you're going. But how, if this is going to happen, I think what we're coming up against here, and the reality that you're trying to highlight, is that it does seem, I mean, there is a pipeline now from Siberia to Shanghai, and whether that's long-term, there will be more such fossil fuel development on that scale, who knows, but it is happening. So it's a reality. How?
But it's bad business. It's bad business because we know that we cannot use all the fossil fuels in the world.
Okay, so the Russians apparently
So it's
don't
not-
know that. So
it's-
what governance do you set up, or what organization, or how do you create incentives so that this development is happening in a way that will not lead to the kinds of scenarios that we're talking about? What does that look like?
I think that the businesses understand that it's not a good business in the future to invest in fossil fuels because we cannot use it. And all the countries in the world, I think almost all the countries in the world, are understanding that we need to implement also political policies that we need to stop using fossil fuels in the future. So I think that businesses understand that it's not very long-term solution. So
I don't want to come off as being anti-addressing these issues, but I invest money for the job, and I have to look at the real world every day of what is happening in the markets and around the world. And the reality is that while businesses may greenwash and talk about all the wonderful things that they're doing, that there has to be a stronger sense of setting up incentives to get this addressed.
What are those?
Mr. Meinhardt, I think this week, and in fact today at Davos, there's been a session with the oil and gas and the banking and investment community, where in fact the banking and investment community really did a call out that they literally said, continued investment in fossil fuel, we will starve that out because we're not going to invest. So I think that discussion is changing dramatically, and I think we've seen a sea change in terms of incentives from the banking and finance community. So I would say that what you said used to be true, and I'm not so sure it will continue to be true.
Well, but
actually, for example, European Investment Bank made a decision that it won't finance fossil fuels after 21. So I think this is the way to go. It's the future, and I think the businesses need to look at this because it's risk for the investments and the investors if you invest in fossil fuels.
Also,
how many hundreds of billions do you handle?
how many hundreds of millions do I have?
Billions.
Not a relevant question.
Tell us your
Please, go ahead.
take, Mr. Vice President. What would you suggest?
Generation Investment Management manages through the lens of sustainability. And when you use the phrase the real world, one of the worst performing asset classes in the last 10 years has been fossil fuels. People are losing money. BlackRock made its announcement last week. By one measure, they've lost $90 billion for their clients just because of their overinvestment in fossil fuels. Chevron just announced that it was writing down the value of its assets. Repsol, a mid-market major in Spain, just announced that it was marking down its assets. BP just announced a month ago that it was going to, that a good bit of its assets in the ground will never see the light of day. The cost reduction curve for solar electricity and wind electricity is taking away a good portion of the liquid fuels markets for the petroleum industry. We're also seeing, with the rise of electric vehicles, within 2 years the drivetrain is going to be significantly lower in cost than internal combustion engines. Every automobile manufacturer in the world is shifting away from internal combustion engines toward electric vehicles. And there is a growing recognition that of the 28 trillion, this is according to the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and the IPCC, of the $28 trillion of carbon-based assets marked to market on the books of multinationals and sovereigns, 22 trillion is unlikely to ever be put to its intended use. So the idea, and people are canceling out of tar sands investments and the marginal investments, and the most marginal oil and gas investments of all are the ones proposed for the Arctic Ocean. And the ones that have started up there, they've turned around and come back. And, I could be wrong. All these analysts could be wrong. But the overwhelming evidence from the real world indicates that it's not going to happen.
If I could just come. Yeah.
Let's bring this back.
Sorry, yeah, I would like to talk about the real world because I think science can give us an understanding of the real world. I mean, it's about physics. It's about the images I showed you. That is the real world. And I think we have to come back to remember that while it might be economically inconvenient to get away from fossil fuel, the real world that science gives evidence of is saying how fast we have to do this.
If I can intervene here, I think, if I understand correctly, Mr. Minard, what you might be trying to point out in part is that those things may be and are facts. Not everyone is going to act accordingly. And I think this is where policy comes in. So in the absence of, for example, a carbon price, should we be talking here a little bit about, companies are changing their behavior, banks are taking steps. What kinds of policy actions on a sovereign level, but also internationally, would help to protect the Arctic and to deal with some of the issues that are contributing here?
Put a price on carbon.
It would be very effective. And of course,
and you all agree. Do you all actually agree on this one?
well, of course, in EU we have market for carbon, and also in the states, the state level, California has very ambitious market for carbon. So
Washington, Oregon, the New England states,
etc. So I think this is something that we need to have wider area and also we need to work together.
Yes.
So a price on carbon, if we accept contentiously that some level of development is unstoppable in the Arctic, whether or not it's a very good idea, and perhaps Total is investing with the Russians and it seems to be going forward with an Arctic project. There are some companies going forward. If we accept that is happening, what kind of governance needs to be put in place? Is the Arctic Council, Mr. Vice President, you might have a view on this, is the Arctic Council adequate in terms of governance?
I think the Arctic Council is an innovative intergovernmental body that promotes exchanges of views and comparison of policies that might be effective. It doesn't have, much clout except the force of persuasion, and I think it's been extremely useful. Now, the current U.S. administration has turned its back on the Arctic Council, and don't get me started on that. That would be a cul-de-sac we don't want to go into. But presumably we'll get back to a version of sanity, and we will have an Arctic Council that once again plays a very constructive role.
Would you like to add to that, Madam Prime Minister, given your role? And you recently, I believe Finland, before you took over, was at the head of the Arctic Council. Is this adequate to governance in handling these issues in the region?
Yes, Finland was the president of the Arctic Council before my time. And we did raise many important issues to the table. For example, the black ice, the black carbon. Sorry, my bad English. The black carbon issue, because it's so important. We know that other emissions are more important, but the black carbon has so many points that we need to tackle. For example, because it increases the melting of the ice, and it's also actually a health issue, because if you create black carbon, it also infects how people's health is.
The air pollution associated with it kills about 9 million people a year around the world. But it also fertilizes a form of algae in the ice. The nitrogen content does, which is responsible for almost half of the darkening of the surface of Greenland.
But a couple of things here, because we keep talking about what can be done. And for instance, if we're going to have Arctic shipping, and we already do have Arctic shipping, right, then shouldn't there be standards set? For instance, should we have zero emission shipping through the Arctic? Because dumping all that black carbon on the ice is going to accelerate everything.
Great idea.
Right? I mean, the thing that I feel here is that, again, I'm not advocating the climate change is a great thing. I think it's a massive problem. What I'm really trying to say, I think there's a certain cognitive dissonance, which is when you receive the message that you don't want to hear, the response is to attack the messenger. And
I'm not attacking you.
I am a Republican, so.
So what? I don't care. I think your idea on zero emission shipping in the Arctic is wonderful. And you know, the shipping industry, Maersk, for example, has made a commitment to zero carbon shipping already by 2030, I think. And they admit we don't know how to do it, but we're going to do it. That's great. It might be great if the shipping industry could get agreement that one of the pilot routes for the zero emission would be on these new Arctic routes. I think that's a terrific idea. But on your cognitive dissonance, we don't really know each other, and I respect you. I don't want to, but on your what got me earlier was when you said, we're going to cross the tipping point. Nothing can stop it.
Well,
I don't agree with that.
If we go for another century,
okay,
we're going to cross the tipping.
Don't give up. Despair is just another form of denial. We have limitations as human beings. We have weaknesses for sure. But in times past, when the chips have been down and we have had to transcend those limitations and rise above them, we have done so. This is a moment when we must do that. There is still hope that we can do this. Rudy Dornbush, a famous economist at MIT, author of what's known as Dornbush's Law, famously said, things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen much faster than you thought they could. We're seeing that with renewable energy. We're seeing that with Greta and the young people who are leading the new political movement here. Unfortunately, we're also seeing it with the rate of harm and damage, but I'm convinced that there is a realistic basis for hope and that we're going to succeed.
Sure. Well, and please don't.
I think we should take some questions from the audience at this point, if we can. That's nice. Yes, please, in the second row over here, and then the gentleman in the front.
Thank you for that very interesting discussion. I actually work in the climate change technology development area, and one thing which I'm really struggling with, there's a lot of conversation around we need to do this in the climate change domain, but a lot of investment is being talked about. Banks are saying that we're going to invest in this, but most of the investment is going into stuff which is already proven and established. And yes, wind and solar plants are all going to be part of the solution, but there's a lot of early stage investment required to really develop these technologies which are out there in the TRL1 to TRL3 stage, which need to come out, and that's going to be part of the solution which actually can stop and get to your solution of not going to the 100-year line and hitting the wall and actually solving these problems. And that investment is missing. TRL3 to TRL9, even breakthrough investments, breakthrough energy investments, or OGCI, don't invest that. Nothing is getting invested below TRL7. That's where we need funding. That's where we need investment management to come together. What are you guys thinking about that?
Thank you. Did you have a question, sir, in the front?
Well, it's essentially the same question. Nobody's mentioned research. So let me add a little figure. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States spent $4.2 trillion in today's dollars to defeat Germany and Japan. Right. When are we going to recognize that climate change is a much more serious enemy than either of those two countries?
Thank you. Any other questions? No. We have a few minutes left. I think it would be interesting. It's when we started talking about this panel, Professor Whiteman, one of the things you pointed out to me a couple of times was that it's really impossible to talk about the Arctic without talking about the rest of the world. And that if you're going to talk about ways to develop the Arctic sustainably and to ensure that the worst case scenarios in the Arctic don't come to pass, you have to talk about steps in the rest of the world and steps globally to contain climate change. Can we use the time remaining to come up with some solutions? Because that's one of the really different and special things about the World Economic Forum, is that it is solution focused. What are some of the solutions, we've touched on some, that could be developed globally to tackle this problem? Prime Minister?
Well, I find that the EU's initiative for Green Deal, it's a big thing. I think it's very big step forward, and I salute this agenda that's been given out, and Finland fully supports this. And I think that all the countries have to do their part. It's not that Finland itself can change the path for climate change. We need all the countries in the world together fighting this. EU can lead the way, and we have been doing so, but we also need the United States, we need Russia, we need China, we need all the key players to finding solutions. And I think even though the Arctic Council isn't a body that it's efficient in every way, it's a forum where we can talk about the issues concerning Arctic, climate issues, other environmental issues, and other issues that we have. So we need solutions that we can find together, and also forums where we can build trust. And also we have to take the people in the countries a part of this, because we cannot do the change if we don't have the acceptance from the individuals and the human beings. And when we are talking about that we want to be climate neutral by 2035, it's very important to us that we do this in a way that it's socially just and fair and acceptable. So we need to make sure that people are benefiting from tackling climate change. And we are trying to find our path this way. And I think it's very important for all the countries trying to find socially acceptable ways to creating new jobs, to creating new opportunities, to creating new possibilities for people, and taking them a part of this.
Thank you. Professor Whiteman.
I think that from a scientific perspective, because the Arctic is so important everywhere else, what concerns me about the Arctic Council is that it has largely been Arctic country focused, with some observers coming in. And the data, I mean, some could call climate scientists prophets of doom. I don't agree with that. I think we just simply give the evidence. But what we need is governance mechanisms where the rest of the world is actually paying attention to what's going on in the Arctic, because it will affect where you live, everybody in this room. There's no question of that. And right now there's not a place in the Arctic Council for that voice, those voices to come in. And that concerns me. I mean, I think that the COP in Glasgow, COP26, has to become the ice COP, as opposed to the blue COP that was in Madrid, perhaps, and earlier. This really will be about what's going on in the Arctic and how we are going to respond to that really barometer of global risk. And I'm not quite sure how and where to do that. That's the job of heads of state, I think. But I think that's what concerns me about the Arctic Council right now.
Well, I mean, I think I'm the free markets guy, and I think people are incented to do, as I mentioned before, what's in their economic best interest. We all know that it is cheaper to produce a kilowatt of electricity using an alternative than to burn fossil fuels. But the industry is laden down with legacy assets, and they can't just throw them away. Though I think it's in their best interest to throw them away and get rid of them, and to accelerate the change that's necessary. And so, you know, you mentioned the write-down of all the reserves around the world. The peculiar truth here is, once they extract any of those reserves and use them, their profit margin is going to be higher in the future because they have no book value and they don't have to amortize book value away. So it's going to inflate their earnings, which is going to make people think that it's a good opportunity. Somehow, you know, and that's why I favor a carbon tax. You know, I think what you have to do is push the economic burden off onto these people who essentially are creating a future liability to which they're not going to be held accountable to pay. Right? When New York City is underwater, which oil company are we going to get them to pay for all this? Right? So the reality is they have to pay the bill up front.
Yes.
And we need to put that kind of incentive in place to make the real progress we need.
Mr. Vice President?
Yeah, well, later this year, the reference was made to COP20, the Conference of the Parties, number 26 in Glasgow in November this year instead of
Yes, it's
December.
November.
Is very important because it's the beginning of the first 5-year review period. The Paris Agreement includes a very crucial provision that every 5 years all the signatory nations are required to reassess whether or not they can increase their ambition and have much steeper emissions reductions. And by the way, the U.S. is not out of the Paris Agreement. Most of you may know that regardless of what President Trump says, under the law, the first day the U.S. could withdraw from the Paris Agreement is the day after the next presidential election in November. And if there's a new president, excuse me for a moment, then a new president could give 30 days notice and the U.S. would be right back in. But this review period is crucially important. So what changes would I make? First of all, we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are subsidized by governments around the world at a rate 36 times greater than the meager subsidies given to speed up the development and deployment of renewables. That's insane. China, Japan, and Korea are directly subsidizing the construction of brand new dirty coal plants in Southeast Asia, in parts of Africa, Indonesia. It's utterly insane and completely irresponsible. And then some way we have to get a direct or indirect recognition of the harms done by carbon emissions in the accounting system of the global economy. A tax is very difficult. Some jurisdictions have done it. Politically toxic in the U.S. I know in January of 1993, the Clinton-Gore administration's first budget, one of my great victories as vice president in the first quarter of the administration was to get a carbon tax in our initial budget. And it passed the House of Representatives, but then failed by one vote in the Senate, where all good ideas go to die. Then it happened again in the first 6 months of President Obama's administration. But there are, as you said, Prime Minister, a lot of state governments that have already done it, a lot of city governments, and there now is the beginning of a sentiment within the Republican Party in the U.S. to support this. A lot of their senior statesmen are now pushing it hard. I don't know, I hope so, but one way or another, that's really what we have to get done.
Thank you. And Professor?
And we got to plant 1 trillion trees. Klaus Schwab and Mark Benioff and others have launched that initiative here, which I think is great. We got to have regenerative agriculture to also sequester more in soils and much more besides.
And President Trump has agreed to be part of the
trillion tree initiative.
Let's give Professor Whiteman the last word.
I would just like to say that science gives you a reality check. We're in trouble, so let's stop investing in fossil fuel development.
I will thank you all. We've come at this from very different perspectives, but I think found some common shared potential policies and definitely some shared goals. And I think that that's because we all live in the real world. It's just a different. Thank you very much.
Elena.
Thank you so much to all of you.